OpenAI's cheapest tier is 5 times cheaper on input tokens than Anthropic's cheapest tier. If you're running a million API calls a month, that gap shows up on your invoice in a way that's hard to ignore. Both companies just updated their model lineups and pricing, so this is the right time to look. I'm comparing OpenAI versus Anthropic across 5 tests, pulling from official pricing pages, published benchmarks, and developer docs, and every number I cite is one I could actually verify. That pricing gap might not even be the number that changes your decision. There's a reasoning benchmark result that could flip everything for you, and we get to that in test 2. My name is Brian, and I'm in these tools 12 hours a day, so you don't have to be. I went through every number both companies will actually stand behind, so you can make a real decision, not just a guess based on hype. You've probably heard both OpenAI and Anthropic are great, and yeah, they kind of are. But if you're a solo dev or a small team running thousands of API calls a day, the wrong choice means you're burning budget on tokens you didn't need to pay for, and that's the actual stake here. Test 1. API pricing. Per token cost at scale. OpenAI's Luna tier runs 0.20 per million input tokens, and that number matters a lot when you're hitting the API a few 100,000 times a day, and your invoice shows up at the end of the month looking way bigger than you planned. What I found here is pretty interesting. OpenAI's Luna tier is 0 or 20 per million input tokens versus Anthropic's Haiku at 1.00, so that's a 5x gap on input and 4 times cheaper on output. Mid-range is close too. OpenAI Terra at $2 input versus Anthropic Sonnet at $3, about 33% cheaper. One caveat though, at the flagship tier, they're nearly identical. Okay, so this one's a tie on the scoreboard, and I think that's the right call. At the flagship tier, Sol at $5 input and Anthropic Opus at $5 input, they're basically the same price, so the gap only shows up in the cheaper tiers. One tie on the board. Test 2, reasoning and accuracy on complex tasks. A solo dev shipping a production agent on a deadline needs to know which model actually gets the hard stuff right, because a wrong answer in a coding task or a math problem doesn't just fail quietly. It ships broken code or bad output to real users. What surprised me here is how lopsided the published data is. Anthropic has actual per-task numbers. 62.3% on SWE bench, 96.5% on physics problems, 96.2% on Math 500. OpenAI? I couldn't find comparable per-task figures for their current models. OpenAI does lead a composite index, but there's no per-task breakdown to verify it against. Anthropic takes this one, and it's not really close on the published evidence. Both companies' benchmark pages looked pretty different from what I expected, and OpenAI just doesn't have the per-task numbers out there right now. Anthropic 1, OpenAI 0, 1 tie. Anthropic's on the board. Test 3, safety guardrails and moderation. If your product goes live and the model starts generating harmful content because your filters weren't set up right, that's a compliance problem and a PR problem at the same time, and the depth of the documentation you're working with matters a lot when you're trying to set this up fast. Both have moderation APIs, which is good. OpenAI gives you category-specific violation scores across hate, violence, self-harm, and sexual content. Anthropic has a unified harm framework that includes human review and external expert testing for vulnerabilities. Looking at the docs, Anthropic's safeguard documentation goes a lot deeper on process. Now, before you call this for Anthropic, take a step back. More documentation doesn't automatically mean better protection in practice. OpenAI's moderation API has published specific category scores you can actually build logic against. Anthropic's approach is more policy-driven. They're just different philosophies, and depending on your use case, either one might fit better. This one's a tie. Anthropic's docs are genuinely more detailed, and their reputation on safety is well earned. But OpenAI's moderation API is concrete and usable in ways Anthropic's isn't. Neither wins outright. That's 2 ties now. Anthropic still leads 1-0. 2 tests left, and this is where it gets relevant to your actual workflow. Test 4 is response latency, and the data situation there is going to surprise you. Then test 5 is context window, and that one is where OpenAI has a real shot at evening the score. Test 4, response latency and inference speed. You've probably heard people say OpenAI feels faster, and if you're building a real-time app where users are waiting on a response, that feeling translates directly into whether they stay on your product or close the tab. So I went looking for actual numbers. Alright, so here's what I found, and it's kind of frustrating. OpenAI has a published latency optimization guide with strategies you can actually apply. Anthropic, I couldn't find a comparable published resource, but neither vendor publishes measured tokens per second benchmarks, so a direct speed comparison just isn't possible with the data that's out there right now. No winner here. Neither company has tokens per second numbers published anywhere I could find, which honestly caught me off guard. OpenAI gets credit for having a latency guide, but that's not the same as measured speed data. Call it a third tie. Score stays Anthropic 1, OpenAI 0. Test 5, context window and long document handling. The day your model hits a token limit mid-document and starts losing context on a 200-page contract, or a giant codebase, your whole pipeline breaks. So which one actually gives you more room to work with? What I found here is pretty close. OpenAI's top tiers, Sol, Terra, and Luna, all sit at 1.05 million tokens. Anthropic's Opus and Sonnet flagship tiers are at 1 million tokens. That's a 50,000 token difference, about 5% more room on the OpenAI side, and both are consistent across their flagship tiers, which is good to know. OpenAI takes this one, though I'll be honest, the gap is smaller than I expected going in. 1.05 million versus 1 million is marginal in most real workflows. Still, OpenAI gets the win on raw capacity. That ties the series. OpenAI 1, Anthropic 1, 3 ties. OpenAI wins on price at the lower tiers. Luna comes in at 0.20 per million input tokens versus Haiku's 1-AR, so you're looking at a 5x cost advantage there. The context window tops out at 1.05 million tokens, a 5% edge. OpenAI also publishes cached input pricing, which Anthropic doesn't, and it leads composite general-purpose benchmarks on the AAI index. Anthropic wins on published per-task accuracy. Claude has 62.3% on SWE Bench, 96.5% on Physics, and 96.2% on Math 500, numbers OpenAI simply hasn't published for current models. Anthropic's safety documentation is also more detailed, with human review and external testing baked into the framework. Alright, so here's the honest call. I went in thinking OpenAI would dominate on price and pull ahead overall, but the series ended tied 1-1 with 3 ties, and the 5x price gap only shows up in the cheaper tiers. So, if you need cheap tokens and big context, go OpenAI. If you need verified reasoning benchmarks and documented safety, go Anthropic. The input cost difference is real, but it's not the whole story. I ran Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.8 head-to-head against Google's Gemini 1.5 Pro next, and the pricing story flips in a pretty interesting way at the mid-range tier. That comparison is already on the channel if you want to keep going.